Hey, this is Steve from Great Lakes True Crime. I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a fantastic 2019. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Michael, host of the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast, which was nominated as one of the best British true crime podcasts of 2018, is based on my 5-star rated guided walk, and features more than 300 untold, unsolved, and long-forgotten murders, all set within 1 square mile of London's West End. So if you love hearing about new cases for the first time, all cases through a fresh pair of ears, and classic cases with a twist, all researched using the original declassified police investigation files, written using first-hand accounts, and recorded using authentic sounds from the murder location itself, then Murder Mile is just for you. Download the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast on iTunes, Acast, or your favourite podcast platform every Thursday. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.
September 13th, 1990, was the day Lisa Pruett told all her friends was the happiest day of her life. Unfortunately for Lisa, it would also be her last day. From the South Shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. Lisa Pruett was a popular student at Shaker Heights High School. Shaker Heights is an inner-ring, east-side suburb of Cleveland. It was developed as a planned community, designed to be a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of inner-city Cleveland. The city has very stringent building and zoning codes, which has helped the city maintain a vibrant housing stock. In fact, 75% of the city is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Shaker Heights is also the birthplace and hometown of Paul Newman. Back to Lisa. She was bright, witty, and she loved poetry. Lisa was involved in all kinds of extracurricular activities, things like student council, marching band, softball, field hockey, and the school newspaper. As a very talented writer, she even wrote poems for the school's literary magazine. And Lisa had a boyfriend. His name was Dan Dryfort, who was kind of a rebel and a bad boy at Shaker. Dan was in a high school rock band that he created, and the band practiced in Dan's basement in an area he called, quote, the Howling Commando Room. He had a habit of getting high on cough syrup, which is something I can't imagine trying. But he supposedly learned about this at church camp and introduced it to his friends when back at home. He even went so far as to host cough syrup parties at his house, where everyone got high on Robitussin while listening to music. Witnesses said that the cough syrup sometimes made Dan black out and turn violent. Dan and Lisa had been friends for quite a few years, but it wasn't until April of 1990 that they fell in love during a high school band trip to Germany. Dan was Lisa's first true love, but on that day, September 13th, 1990, he had been away for more than a month, so it was a welcome surprise when he showed up at school that afternoon. But while it was a very good day for Lisa, former classmate Kevin Young was not having a good day. It seemed that Kevin didn't have all that many good days in general. He was preparing to start his freshman year at Ohio State the following week, but he was consumed with the news that a former classmate of his had been deployed to Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion. Kevin wasn't so worried about the classmate as much as he was about the idea that a draft could be coming. Worrying and irrational fears were nothing new to Kevin. One time on a band trip to Toronto, he had a bit of a meltdown after being rejected by a girl he fancied. Now, Kevin wasn't a bad-looking guy. In fact, he was said to have been quite handsome, but his personality apparently didn't match his dashing good looks. Kevin would obsess over African Americans and Jews and talk about how he believed they were ruining Shaker Heights. Anyway, after the rejection on that Toronto trip, Kevin threatened to jump off of his hotel balcony. After that incident, he received treatment for his mental state, including medication and inpatient care for a while. The medication was effective, but Kevin wasn't too fond of taking it, so his parents let him stop it in October of 1989. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, the Arabica coffee house chain was really popular in the Cleveland area. The Cleveland area was still for the most part devoid of Starbucks, and independent coffee houses were the go-to place for young people. In fact, when I wasn't hanging out at one, I was doing some side jobs for them. Kevin spent a lot of time at the Arabica at Shaker Square, where he enjoyed playing chess against very competitive players. Kevin was by all accounts a protege. Anyway, that's what he was doing that September 13th, hanging out at the Shaker Square Arabica, playing chess all day and well into the night. Late that night, around 10 o'clock, Kevin's friend Ken Workman stopped by to hang out at Arabica. Ken was better known as Tex, and he and Kevin had become blood brothers the year before, actually pressing their bloody fingers against one another. Tex was dating a girl named Debbie Dryfort, who was the elder sister of Lisa's boyfriend, Dan Dryfort. Deb had graduated the year before from high school and had already headed off to her freshman year at Ohio University in Athens, which is southeast of Columbus. Tex, on the other hand, was only 16 and still a student at Shaker Heights. Tex was a bit of a bad boy himself. It turns out he was on probation at the time for committing a number of crimes. Kevin and Tex sat and talked for close to an hour at Arabica. Tex mentioned that Dan was holding one of his cough syrup parties that night and that Lisa would be there around midnight or maybe 12:30. While Tex was planning on staying overnight at the Dryfort's house after the party, Kevin was not surprised that he was not invited. He knew he was a social misfit. He had a few friends, but not many. Virtually no one at school knew that he had just spent over a month in the psych ward. He was being treated for his suicidal tendencies, among other psychological issues, with medication and therapy. It didn't seem to help much, though. On a short leave from the clinic at the end of August, he overdosed on antihistamines but was saved when his sister and Tex called the poison control hotline. On September 13th at 2 p.m., Dan was discharged from the psych ward. His father, a prominent Cleveland attorney, picked him up. About an hour after getting picked up, Dan rode his bike to the school to surprise Lisa. He found her studying chemistry with Kim Rathbone, who lived in the house directly behind Dan's. Before he dated Lisa, Dan and Kim had been an item, and they were still pretty close, often talking through the fence that separated their properties or by phone until late at night. Soon after arriving at the school, a bunch of Dan's friends sought him out to welcome him back. At the end of the school day, he walked Lisa out to her mom's car. But as soon as Dan got home again, Kim came over. They sat on the back porch and talked. Kim wanted Dan to return some of the items she had sent to him to cheer him up while he was in the hospital. Dan asked Kim for a favor before she left. He wanted Kim to cut his hair. Later that evening, after Dan had dinner, Tex stopped over, and they hung out on the porch playing a little guitar and shooting the breeze in general. Around 9 o'clock, Lisa stopped by just for a few minutes while her dad waited in the car. When they came back, they were talking about Dan's hair. "I want to cut your hair," Dan told Lisa, according to Tex. He even had clippers. "And I want Tex to hold you down while I do it." So this seems a little strange at best. And what's with Dan and all the haircut talk the day he gets home from the hospital? Anyway, before she left, Lisa told Dan that she would sneak out of her house around midnight and come over to the party. A couple of their friends, Chris Jones and Becca Boatwright, planned to do the same thing. So Lisa left, and Tex rode Dan's bike to Shaker Square for cigarettes, came back, and then left again for good. About 11:30 that night, Dan went to his bedroom and listened to some music, a live recording of REM from a 1987 concert in Holland. Around midnight, his sister Deb called from OU and talked to their mom and dad for a while before Dan got on the phone in their den to talk to her. According to Dan's father, Dan ended his conversation with Deb and returned to his bedroom at 12:15. 15 minutes later, the awful screaming began. Those screams were Lisa's. Just 30 feet from Dan's house, she laid on the ground, dying. She had been stabbed 21 times. By the time police got there, she was dead. Her clothes had been partially torn off, and she was bruised on her neck. Her eyes were still wide open, aimed at Dan's house. The next morning, Dan was being questioned in Lisa's murder and had been read his Miranda rights. He was the prime suspect. During questioning, Dan described Lisa's screams as though they came from someone who was being forced to do something she didn't want to do. They lasted for about 15 seconds. He also told police that he had forgotten Lisa was coming over to meet him that night. Dan's room and his parents' bedroom were connected by a Jack and Jill bathroom. Dan said when they heard the screams, his dad yelled, "Did you hear that?" through the bathroom, and Dan was in his parents' bedroom by the time Lisa's screams stopped. Dan's father, Robert, told police that his initial reaction was to run outside and see what happened. But Dan still had his clothes and moccasins on, so he sent Dan out first. Dan ran outside to the front lawn and looked toward the corner of Lee and South Woodland. Dan's father, now dressed, arrived at the door. They both told police they couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, so they went back inside. The detectives asked Dan if, at that point, he had thought that the screams may have belonged to Lisa, since she was supposed to be coming over. Dan said that he had not thought about that at first, but after a while did go back outside alone and found Lisa's bike thrown in his neighbor's bushes near the sidewalk. He said he then ran home, called her house and got the answering machine, and then decided to call 911, but all without telling his parents. During the questioning, Dan lied at least once to police. He told the officer that his parents knew that Lisa was going to come over that night, which they didn't. As the police officer searched the area that night, Dan went inside and woke up Mr. Dryford, who went outside to speak with police. Dan went inside and went to sleep while the search for Lisa continued outside his house. The next night, Chris came over to the Dryford house to spend the night. Chris, Dan, and Deb got together in the basement to discuss the murder. Chris later told detectives that they speculated Kevin Young might have done it. He said that theory started from Shane McGee and John George. The story was that about a month earlier, Kevin was overheard saying that he wanted to kill both Dan and Lisa. Lisa because of his deep, unrequited love for her, and Dan because he stole Lisa away from him. The alleged threats were never reported at the time. They weren't mentioned to police until the next day, September 15th, when Shane and John went to the Shaker Heights police with their story. Shane told police that Kevin heard Dan had been intimate with Lisa, and Kevin got super angry and aggressive in response to the news. Shane went on to say that Kevin proclaimed that he would kill Dan and launch war on the female race. He supposedly wanted to kill Lisa as well. From that point on, Dan's friends repeatedly said things about Kevin possibly being the killer and other incendiary things about Kevin. It's not known if they really believed he may have been the killer or if they were simply trying to turn the attention away from Dan, who was initially looked at as the prime suspect by police. It's usually the boyfriend or husband, isn't it? Several female classmates also told police that they heard Kevin make some statements, either alluding to the fact that he wanted to kill Lisa or that he knew details about the crime that were not yet made public. In a second statement to police, Tex brought up a detail that had not been mentioned in his first interview. Tex said that when he and Kevin were hanging out at Arabica that one night, he told Kevin that Lisa was planning to visit Dan later that night. Not only was this an important new assertion to be made, but through one way or another, the record of that second interview conducted on September 17th was recorded as having been conducted on September 14th, the day of the first interview. For his part, Kevin Young denied ever having threatened Lisa and also denied ever having that conversation with Shane McGee and John George. After leaving Shaker Square the night of the murder, he said he came home and his mom and dad saw him go up to bed at 11:30 p.m. At 11:45, he went downstairs and watched TV because he couldn't sleep. The detectives, however, did not believe Kevin. Kevin offered to take a polygraph, but detectives chose instead to just observe him through a two-way mirror and apparently drew conclusions from his behavior while left alone in the room. From this moment on, Kevin was the one and only suspect. A search warrant was served at Kevin Young's house on September 16th. Police found drawings of pentagrams, a devil face, and a heart tattooed with a Christian cross, stabbed and dripping blood. And his diary was equally melodramatic. Quote, "This is day 1 of my diary. My mom is a bitch and I hate her. I'll explain tomorrow." End quote. In another entry, he said, quote, "I just want to take over the world, make the blacks and Jews and the Slavs and the Latins and the yellows and the Semites subordinate to us. I am worth absolutely nothing." End quote. Whether it was an error or deliberate, police incorrectly logged the evidence from the house search as September 14th, again giving the false impression that Kevin was a suspect before Dan's friends began to implicate him. Detectives also obtained samples of Dan's writings from his time spent in the Cleveland Clinic's psychiatric ward, which were much more explicit than the writings found at Kevin's house. Police, however, didn't seem that interested in them. In one letter to Lisa, Dan wrote, quote, "After I get out, give me some time to return to normal. I don't want you or I to make any poor decisions because of this place." End quote. In another note to Lisa, Dan said, quote, "Someday I'll go too far and do something very bad, and you'll yell at me and be serious, and I won't be able to handle it. But you can't let me get away with murder. I look at you and see what I've done to you. I'm a bad influence on people." End quote. And finally, in another note to Lisa, he wrote, quote, "I want to poke your eyes out with my favorite pocket knife." End quote. Detectives also pulled the phone records of Tex Workman and Debbie Dryfort. The records established that Tex called Debbie's dorm at 12:19 a.m. and the two talked until 12:54. So this ruled out Tex as a suspect, but it also increases the known amount of time that Dan was alone prior to anyone hearing Lisa's screams. Police hired licensed psychiatrists to help with the case, but police were only interested in understanding one mental patient. A local FBI agent referred Shaker Heights detectives to Special Agent James Wright, a profiler working out of FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. Agent Wright told them over the phone that based on the diary, Kevin Young has no ego, has low self-esteem, and that his personality definitely fit that of a person capable of committing the crime. To me, this seems like a giant leap to make from a diary entry and also forgets the fact that virtually anyone is capable of committing a crime. Anyway, on September 25th, Shaker Heights detectives and Special Agent John Dunn flew to Quantico to speak to Wright in person. Agent Wright and his staff at Quantico described Kevin as a John Hinckley-type personality, someone who fantasized about women from afar. Of course, I've been to high school, and this likely describes quite a few of the boys in high school. Anyway, they went on to suggest that Kevin might actually be a serial killer. They went over strategies for a polygraph interview, begin at night and be prepared to question him for hours, provide lots of soda and cigarettes, talk about the crime in the third person. By this time, Kevin had begun his freshman year at Ohio State and was living in his dorm. He thought maybe this was all behind him. But then on October 26, 1990, while he was on the phone with his dad, there was a knock at the door. It was Shaker Heights Police Sergeant Tom Gray. Kevin told his dad that he would call him back. Sergeant Gray usually worked with juveniles. He had the soft approach that the profiler said would be needed to get Kevin to confess. Before the polygraph was administered, Gray spoke to Kevin for a long time in a Columbus hotel room. There were plenty of cigarettes and soda on hand. At first, Gray let Kevin lead the conversation. They talked about the growing trouble in the Middle East and the threat of a draft. Gray told Kevin about how, when he was a teenager, he had to worry about the Vietnam draft. Gray asked Kevin to put himself in the place of the person who killed Lisa and explain what he thought happened. "Just between us?" asked Kevin. He then told Gray that he thought Lisa had been riding her bike when the killer grabbed her. He said the killer hadn't planned the attack, that he was just walking around and saw Lisa, and when she got close, something snapped. Kevin was sure that whoever had done it would never kill again, because he was so scared when Lisa died. How he thought or knew those things is anyone's guess. Gray pushed for details that only the killer would know, but Kevin wouldn't help him. Still pretending to think like the killer, Kevin told him that the man probably stabbed Lisa from the front just a couple times. But Lisa had actually been stabbed mostly from behind, 21 times. Then Gray asked, "Is there any reason we might find your fingerprints on Lisa's jeans?" Kevin told him to take his fingerprints if that's what he believed. He said there was no way his prints could be on Lisa's clothes. He again offered to submit to a polygraph. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when Kevin was finally hooked up to the lie detector in an adjacent hotel room. Polygraph expert Tom Kohansky asked Kevin 7 questions. According to Kohansky, 2 of the 7 responses were inconclusive. On the other 5 questions, he found minor deception. He told Sergeant Gray that Kevin seemed tired and should rest before being questioned again. So Gray let Kevin sleep. Early the next afternoon, Gray treated Kevin to lunch at a nearby Pizza Hut. When they got back, Kevin returned to the polygraph room with Kohansky and 2 more tests. Kevin showed deception on most of the questions dealing with Lisa's murder. Kohansky had even confronted Kevin about this, and Kevin cried and said, "I didn't do it." Before Gray left, he told Kevin that until this was resolved, he shouldn't go back to Shaker Heights, as everyone there would treat him as a suspect. According to Gray, Kevin looked him in the eyes and was very emotional, even tearing up. He said he could have admitted to the murder, spent a couple years in a hospital, and then got on with his life, but he said, "I've got to tell you the truth." Then, according to Gray, Kevin said, "I am scared, I feel suicidal, I have nothing to live for." He said he wanted to be hospitalized. That night, Kevin was admitted to Laurelwood Hospital in Willoughby, Ohio, where he remained for 2 months. Kevin's lawyer suggested that he take another polygraph, which he did. This one was admitted by Bill Evans, a known expert in the field, who had been used by both prosecutors and defense lawyers in the past. This time, Kevin passed. The method used by Shaker Heights had been debunked in 1982, according to Kevin's attorney. But Kevin's name was still leaked to the media as the main suspect in Lisa's murder. When word got out that Kevin's father was law partners with the mayor of Shaker Heights, all kinds of cover-up theories began to be floated throughout the media and elsewhere. Reporters even suggested that the Youngs were hiding Kevin at Laurelwood Hospital. Local investigative reporter Carl Munday staked out Kevin's house, waiting for him to return. Many in the Cleveland area are not fans of Carl Munday. If you ever see me out at the pub, ask me to tell you a few stories about him. When Kevin was finally sent home from Laurelwood on December 12th, the media circus kicked into high gear and the rumors circulated around the community for months. And because every detective who spoke on the condition of anonymity said Kevin did it, the people in and around Shaker Heights couldn't understand why he hadn't been arrested. The city hired a public relations consultant to help out with damage control, and police detectives consulted with another psychiatrist to help them pry a confession out of Kevin. Detectives supplied Dr. Murray Myron of Syracuse University with Kevin's statements, interviews, writings, and polygraph results. In a June 11th phone conversation with Shaker Heights Deputy Chief James Brocius, Dr. Myron stated that Kevin could suffer from multiple personality disorder and was able to separate himself from the murder, which was why he didn't fail the polygraph. But after Deputy Chief Brocius casually noted that Lisa's boyfriend had been released from a mental facility that day, Dr. Myron was less certain. Quote, "Understand, I've got a spread of one. You've given me no other suspects. The boyfriend, anything you have. Please send that along, just for the sake of completeness of the file, if nothing else. Until another suspect drops out of the sky, I'd say this is a logical suspect." End quote. Brocius also had some reservations about looking at Kevin as the only suspect. He followed up with Dr. Myron on July 2nd. By then, Myron had some of the evidence related to Dan Dryfort and expressed concern about his behavior the night of the murder. When Myron talks about Dan calling 911 on his own, having all these police vehicles show up outside his home, and then simply going to bed, he said he found that unusual, even somewhat disconcerting. But he said, that's academic because it's not Dan that we're going to be interrogating, it's Kevin, and whether or not he's the guy, we want to give the full shot, use the best psychologist coercion we can. Myron later said they need to run a clockwork orange on Kevin. Despite police's attempts to elicit a confession from Kevin using any psychological techniques they could think of, Kevin never did confess. Although there was never any physical evidence linking Kevin to the crime, Shaker police eventually got their indictment on November 24th, 1992, after two patients from Laurelwood Hospital claimed that Kevin confessed to them. He was charged with aggravated murder. Kevin's father hired Mark Devan, a highly regarded criminal defense attorney in Cleveland, to represent his son. When Assistant County Prosecutor Carmen Marino asked the judge to deny bail at Kevin's arraignment, Devan successfully argued for a reduced bond of $50,000. Kevin's parents put up their home as collateral. Prosecutors immediately knew they were up against a formidable defense for Kevin, and they were dealt another blow when Judge James Sweeney refused to allow them to enter into evidence notes that were taken by Kevin's personal psychiatrist. Myron hinted to reporters that the notes could implicate Kevin in Lisa's murder, but in actuality, there was nothing in the psychiatrist's files that resembled a confession. Kevin's murder trial began on June 28, 1993, and was shown nationwide on Court TV, back when there still was a Court TV. The defense strategy was to implicate Dan Dryfort, at least to the point to cause reasonable doubt in Kevin's guilt. And so Devan had an attentive audience when he got the opportunity to question the boyfriend on the stand. Devan asked him about the seemingly threatening letters he had sent to Lisa. Dan said they were harmlessly funny, and that Lisa thought so too. When asked to explain why he went to sleep when police were outside searching for his girlfriend, Dan said that sleep was his way of escape from what I feared had happened. On July 6th, Devan unveiled a mini bombshell. In a statement by police officer Edward Curtin, who was the first officer to arrive on the scene, Curtin wrote that Dan had told him then that he had never heard Lisa's screams. 11 days later, on July 17th, Kevin's dad took the stand. He testified that at the time of the murder, he and Kevin were playing video games at home and went to bed at 1:15 a.m. On July 21st, the jury delivered their verdict in Kevin's murder trial. After 10 hours of deliberations, the jury foreman read it aloud. Not guilty. A week later, a reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, James McCarty, wrote an article suggesting that jurors would have voted differently if they had access to evidence withheld by the judge. Kevin was devastated by this reckless assertion. That day, he climbed onto a bridge over Interstate 271 and threatened to jump, but a Mayfield Heights police sergeant talked him down. Kevin developed a permanent fear of the media from this whole ordeal. Kevin Young died on January 14, 2017, at the age of 44. He died at home in his apartment in Cleveland Heights, reportedly from a mixture of stress, addiction, and poor health. No one else has ever been charged in Lisa's murder, including Dan Dryfort. The murder weapon has never been found. As best I can tell, Dan Dryford is living in Southern California and is a successful entrepreneur. And Lisa's killer, whomever that may be, has never been brought to justice. If you have any information on the murder of Lisa, please contact Shaker Heights Police at 216-491-1220. The information in this episode was largely taken from the journalism of James Renner. For more information on the Lisa Pruett case or other projects by James Renner, visit jamesrenner.com. For Great Lakes True Crime, this is Steve. Thanks for listening, guys.